Hello and welcome to the video about absolute and comparative advantage. The discussion today is based around how is it that countries make decisions about who will be trading what. Now in this particular case, we are looking at absolute advantage, and absolute advantage occurs when or with the country that has the ability to produce a good or service using fewer resources than another. We have two countries, and the resource that they have is 1 hour. In 1 hour, England can produce or bind 80 books or print 240 pages. Hobbitville can bind 50 books or print 150 pages. Now our goal here is to see who has absolute advantage in binding books and who has absolute advantage in printing pages. So what we want to do is compare who can bind more books in an hour. And we see pretty clearly that within 1 hour, England can produce more books in an hour. That means that each book takes fewer minutes to bind. When we look at printing pages, notice again, England has the ability to print more pages per hour, that is a page in fewer minutes or fewer seconds, than does Hobbitville. And so we see that for this particular combination, England actually has absolute advantage in both products, binding of books and printing of pages. So this really doesn't help us determine which country should bind books and which should print pages, because both of them want to trade together. So what we want to do is we want to look at a deeper, more telling measurement, and that is comparative advantage. Comparative advantage always trumps whatever information we get from absolute advantage. So looking at comparative advantage, this is the ability to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than a competitor. And here we have Stovia and Halligan, and each nation can grow potatoes or sew clothing. Stovia can spend its resources and get 50 bushels of potatoes or 100 clothing items. Halligan can spend its resources and get 100 potatoes or 10 clothing items. Now our goal is to find out what each nation's opportunity cost is for producing potatoes and for producing clothing. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up some T tables and create basically a portion base, or just try to find the proportion of this. And my real question here is, what I know that Stovia can do 50 potatoes or 120 clothing, but what I really need to know is what is the cost in terms of clothing for Stovia to produce 1 bushel of potatoes. So I simply, as I said, as a proportion problem, what I do is I cross multiply, and then what I do is I divide by what's left. And this is going to tell me the cost of 1 potato in terms of clothing. And in this case, I discover that 1 unit of clothing is going to cost me one bushel of potatoes is going to cost Stovia 2.4 units of clothing. Now we want to go ahead and look at Halligan and figure out the same process. Halligan, as we can see, can produce 100 potatoes or 10 clothing. We follow the same process. We cross multiply the 1 times 10, that gets us 10, divide it by the 100, and what that tells us is that we have 1/10 as our solution. And when we work this out, then what we understand is that for Halligan, 1 potato, the cost of producing 1 potato is 1/10 of a clothing item. We also want to flip this around and determine what it is that a clothing unit, a single clothing unit, costs in terms of potatoes. Following the same process, I cross multiply and I divide by what's left. So in this case, cross multiply the 1 times the 50, divide by 120. And what I discover is that the cost of 1 clothing is 42 hundredths of a bushel of potatoes. So in terms of potatoes, the cost to produce 1 clothing is 42 hundredths. And then we look at at Halligan again, and we see that their clothing, they can produce 10 clothing or 100 potatoes, same as we had before. We cross multiply and we divide, and we discover that Halligan can produce 1 unit of clothing, but the cost in clothing is 10 potatoes. So the opportunity cost for 1 clothing is 10 potatoes. So now what we want to do is put this information together so that we can compare it now that we've calculated all that out. Now, when I'm looking at the opportunity cost for potatoes, when I pull that information together, what I see is that the cost of producing 1 bushel of potatoes in terms of clothing is 2.4 items for Stovia. For Halligan, it's only 1/10. So what this means is that Halligan has comparative advantage in producing potatoes, and that country should be producing the potatoes. Now we want to look and see who should do the clothing, and we put this data together, and we see that the opportunity cost, or the cost in terms of potatoes for creating 1 clothing, is 42 hundredths of a potato bushel for Stovia, and it is 10 potato bushels for Halligan. Clearly, Stovia has the lower opportunity cost for sewing clothing, so Stovia has comparative advantage for making clothing. Now, what I hope you notice is that they were opposites. Stovia had comparative advantage in clothing, but Halligan had comparative advantage for potatoes, and that's a common typical relationship when we're looking at comparative advantage. Have a good day.